I can have everybody's attention. Thank you so much for coming. We're very excited here to have the Adventures in Bluegrass with Mr. Bill Keith, banjo extraordinaire. And I'd like to take a moment to introduce the rest of the members of the band. We have Wayne Fugate, who is on mandolin, Stump on guitar, Fooch Fischetti on the fiddle, and Highland High School's very own Roy Coates on bass. We're happy to have Roy back. Come on, come on. Good stuff. Well, without much further ado, we're ready. Adventures in Bluegrass, folks.
Thank you, Dr. Harrington. Hello and welcome to the first presentation of Bluegrass in our schools. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Principal Evans and the Highland Central School District and the Hudson Valley Bluegrass Association for their support of the program today and the special free, did you hear that, free concert right here tonight in the auditorium at 7:30. I hope you'll all be here. The first thing we'd like to do is to kick this off with a piece by the fabulous mandolin player. His name is David Grisman, and it's entitled Opus 57. Okay, in this piece you heard a blending of bluegrass with jazz. This style of music was named dog music by Jerry Garcia, who actually started out playing five-string banjo. That was in the late 1950s, folks. That was before he founded the longest existing 1960s rock band called the Grateful Dead. Garcia had a short-lived bluegrass band, again in the 1970s, and it was called Old and in the Way, and you can still find their records if you care to. They're very good. And later he was actually a member of the David Grisman Quintet, which performed all kinds of jazz and really cool stuff later on. I believe this begins to demonstrate how bluegrass has been significant in influencing American pop music. The real question is, how did this essentially hillbilly music that was from the South finally find its way into the American mainstream and beyond? Let's start with the technology and the invention of the record player, closely followed by the invention of the radio. The ability to record or capture the music and the musician's performance and then to broadcast it made it possible for radio listeners to expand their musical tastes beyond the musical styles that they were used to. They were hearing jazz, classical, race music, or blues, and as America was largely rural in the 1920s and 30s, country music. This early recording of the Carter family may have been received by a radio on a farm somewhere, much like this one right here. And this is a cue.
This Good Neighbor Get Together program is going right on. And here's that original Carter family to do a little singing for you that we trust you enjoy. A.P., Sarah, Maybelle, Jeanette, Helen, June, and Anita, and they're all set to sing that familiar theme song, Keep on Sunny Side.
Keep on sunny side, always on sunny side. Keep on sunny side, oh God. It will help us every day. It will brighten all the way. It will keep on sunny side.
That was the Carter family, one of the first great country recording artists. They started out in the late 20s and went all through the 30s. As recording and broadcasting grew into a successful business venture, the search for artists began in earnest. Need an artist to play music for money during the 20s or the Depression era of the 1930s? No problem. Place a newspaper ad and a line of 100 performers would form up pretty fast. The newly found artists like Jimmy Rogers and the Carter family became the first country recording artists. Their music could be heard regularly on live radio broadcasts. Radio programs would typically be broadcast as the performers played in front of a live audience. Shows would feature comedians also. On-air mentions of a product or advertising was how the radio station made its revenue that kept it in business. Country artists would typically start out at a smaller radio station, and then depending on how popular they became, would move up to larger and larger stations until they reached the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville, Tennessee. Bill Monroe was born September 13th, 1911, and he died September 9th in 1996. He was the youngest in his family. He had two older brothers, Charlie and Birch. Each member of his family played an instrument, including his mother. In the following interview, Bill Monroe talks about his early life with his brothers Birch and Charlie and how he ended up playing the mandolin. Cue number 2.
Oldest, and thought he was more of a
voice of Bill Monroe. Listen close.
And he decided he would be the fiddler, the leader. And Charlie, he was next in line. He wanted the guitar. And I guess I wanted to fiddle and guitar and all of them probably, and I wound up with the mandolin, and that was the deal of it.
Both of you mentioned that your mom played the fiddle. I wondered if you could think of a tune that she played that she rather favored on the fiddle.
She did like to play the fiddle, and like Charlie said, she'd leave the fiddle laying on the bed, and if she'd done her housework of the morning, a lot of times she would pass that fiddle, pick it up and play a tune. And we thought she was the best in the world. I believe they call this tune, How Old Are You?
Bill, I've heard you many times say that you get...
Okay, Bill Monroe was influenced by two people early in his life. One was a black man named Arnold Schultz, who taught him how to play the blues. The other was his uncle on his mother's side. Pen Vandiver was a huge influence on Monroe's concept of how fiddle should sound. Vandiver's fiddle playing through Bill Monroe would become the standard in bluegrass. Here's another excerpt of Bill Monroe talking about his Uncle Pen.
Give your Uncle Pen credit for your sense of timing in music, and I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about that and explain to the folks what you mean by his particular kind of time and how it relates to your sense of time.
Well, he played for most of the square dancing when I was real young, and he had a wonderful shuffle with the bow, and he done his timing with that shuffle, and it seemed like that kind of washed off on me. I've kept that time in my mind, you know, ever since then, and it's helped me a lot.
You used to back him on guitar a lot, didn't you, when he played the square dances?
I have played with him quite a bit, you know, in his last days there. Or I say my last days in Kentucky. I left there when I was 18, and most of the boys had left there then, and he traveled, you know, by either ride a horse or a mule, and lots of times he'd let me ride behind him, and we'd go way back in the country, you know, and maybe play for a square dance. He was the only fiddler around, and they knew that he would furnish a good fiddling for the square dance.
The next song we'd like to do is Bill Monroe's tribute to his uncle. It's entitled Uncle Pen. Bill Monroe's older brothers, Birch and Charlie, started singing as the Monroe Brothers in the 1930s. Later, Charlie and Bill met with some success, but by 1938, they were not getting along very well with each other, and they decided to split up. Bill decided to form his own duet and hired a fellow by the name of Cleo Davis to play guitar and sing with him. They auditioned for 2 radio stations in Atlanta, but were not hired because they already had a brother duet. They suggested Monroe come back when he had a band. So frustrated, Monroe and Davis traveled to Asheville, North Carolina, and were successful in getting a job with station WWNC. They took over a show called Mountain Music Time. Bill then set out to hire a band. In fact, he advertised for musicians over the radio. After the auditions, he and Davis had a fiddle player and a bass player, a quartet with no banjo player yet. Cleo asked him what the band would be named. Bill Monroe's instant reply was, Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys. Over the next months, the Bluegrass Boys grew their audience by developing a very tight, well-rehearsed sound and by using comedy in their act. By October 1939, Bill Monroe and his band had been added to the roster at the biggest one of them all, the Grand Ole Opry. One of Bill Monroe's early hits was suggested to him by Cleo Davis. Davis's mother had taught it to him when he was a child. The song was called Footprints in the Snow. We'd like to play it for you now.
Stepped out, she'd be returning soon. Every time the snow falls, it brings back memories. Wild boundary when the snow was on the ground. I trace her little footprints in the snow. I found her little footprints in the snow. I missed that happy day when Nellie lost her way. And I found her when the snow was on the ground.
Kentucky is still known as the Bluegrass State, but that's not because of Bill Monroe. It had always had that nickname, just like New York is called the Empire State and North Carolina is called the Tar Heel State. Bill Monroe had strong ties to Kentucky because he was born there, in the town of Rosine. The next two songs we'd like to play for you are both by Bill Monroe. Both have Kentucky in the title. The first is called The Kentucky Waltz.
beneath the beautiful harvest moon. And I was the boy that was lucky, but it all ended too soon. I set off on the moonlight. I see no smiling face, and my arm once more for your embrace and the beautiful Kentucky.
How many of you saw the film Walk the Line? How many of you saw the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Okay. A lot of you saw it in my class last year. Both are recent films that highlight country and bluegrass music. Are you beginning to understand why? Okay. It's been around. Johnny Cash was best friends with and worked with a guitar player in Nashville called Carl Perkins. Carl Perkins wrote one of the all-time greatest rock and roll tunes called Blue Suede Shoes. Carl Perkins was describing a conversation he had with Elvis Presley. How many in here know who Elvis Presley is? Okay. Keep listening, keep listening. Carl Perkins was describing a conversation he had with Elvis Presley. Perkins says, quote, I loved bluegrass, I loved blues, and I loved bluegrass. I heard Blue Moon of Kentucky sung by Elvis, and I said, whoa. It was Bill Monroe influenced bluegrass, that up-tempo sound that turned me around in country music. Upon meeting Elvis, and here's the historical fact, Elvis said to me, do you like Mr. Bill Monroe? I said, I love Mr. Bill Monroe. Elvis said, man, I do too. Our next tune was on the King of Rock and Roll's very first hit record, and it was written by, guess who? Mr. Bill Monroe. It's called Blue Moon of Kentucky. Keep on shining.
Keep on shining, shine on, one that's gone, let me woo. It was on that night when the stars were shining bright. They whispered from on high, your love said goodbye. Blue moon of Kentucky, keep on shining. Fugate, keep on shining. Shine on, gonna say goodbye.
Okay. Lester Flatt and the five-string banjoist Earl Scruggs were both members of Bill Monroe's band by 1945. The lineup in that band has been referred to as the original Bluegrass band. I'm going to fast forward because we're running out of time here. Back in the 1950s, Bill Monroe had the Grand Ole Opry kind of sewed up, and Flatt and Scruggs left Bill Monroe's band and made their own band. So now they're in competition with the father of Bluegrass. He didn't like that. So he kept them off the Grand Ole Opry for as long as he could. But in the 1950s, technology went from this to the television. And Flatt and Scruggs, by the early 1960s, were just waiting for an opportunity to take advantage of the new technology so that they could get ahead of Bill Monroe. And in the early 1960s, there was a situation comedy that was invented by CBS in New York about, guess what? Hillbillies. And Flatt and Scruggs took up the opportunity. They went into the studio and they recorded the next tune that became the theme song for the Beverly Hillbillies. Texas tea. Well, first thing you know, old Jet the millionaire, Ken folks said, Jet, move away from here. Said California is the place you ought to be. So load up my truck and Beverly Hills, that is. Swimming pool, movie stars. Okay. We have a very special person with us today. The gentleman playing banjo back in the early 60s was living up in Boston. And even though country music and bluegrass was primarily in the South, he was still listening to it on the radio, he was buying the records, he was listening to folk music, and he had this idea that if he turned the record down real slow, he could figure out how Earl Scruggs was playing that three-finger style banjo. And he wrote out tablature for just about as many of Earl Scruggs' solos were being played at that time. And he had the idea, maybe if I could call him up and go down to Nashville, maybe we could publish a book so that other people wouldn't have to turn the radio or the record player down slow. So he did. He went down to Nashville. He met Earl Scruggs. They made an agreement, and the book that resulted is still used today to teach banjo players all over the world at this point, the three-finger style of Earl Scruggs banjo playing. But not only did the gentleman on stage do that, he was trying some new things, some innovative new techniques on this instrument that's tuned to a G chord. He was listening to the fiddle tunes and playing them note for note, which is not easy if you've ever picked up one of these things. And the style that he had created, he took with him to Nashville when he met Earl Scruggs, and he somehow got backstage, I believe it was at the Grand Ole Opry, and Bill Monroe heard him play, and he says, "I've got to have him in my band." So Bill Monroe hired Bill Keith to be a bluegrass player in the early 1960s. Now, how cool is it to be listening to history right here in the Highland High School auditorium? This is history, folks. There's not a lot of kids across America that get the opportunity to actually listen to somebody who's done what Bill did. I'd like to ask Bill a couple of questions, if you don't mind. And first, Bill, could you tell us what it was like being a member of Bill Monroe's band?
Well, I could fill a couple hours telling you about that, but first of all, it was a wonderful learning experience. He was the guy that invented bluegrass music, and no better person to learn it from. And also, we were traveling widely. I made my first trip to California in the back of his 1959 Oldsmobile, and it was just a big awakening, musically, culturally. Hey, I was from the north, and things in the south were quite a bit different. So it was a wonderful experience, and the musical value, I can't ever replace it. It's just
okay, that sounds like the bell, doesn't it? No? Okay. All right. Okay. Well, would you like to hear one that Bill Keith did in his style? Okay, Blackberry Blossom. Okay, here we go. Don't forget our concert tonight at 7:30. Hope to see you all there. Bring your parents, bring your friends, bring your neighbors. Thank you.